My name is Danielle Metcalf-Shania. Thank you so much for watching these videos and celebrating the 5th anniversary of In This Together with us. I'm a settler living in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, and it's been 5 years since In This Together came out, 7 since we first imagined the collection. So much has happened, and so much has not. Change is not a straight line by any means, both personally and as a community, and I know it can feel incredibly slow at times. Maybe it's because we need to be exposed to something new so many times and in so many different ways for it to shift, for something to click. Over the past 5 years, I've had to face time and again how much I have left to learn and unlearn. I've said and done the wrong thing, had relationships crumble, and wrestled with how to put myself out there when internet culture seems designed to silence us. I've also found beautiful new friendships, collaborations, and hopefully am helping more than I'm harming. Maybe none of us will know that until we leave this life. Some of the contributors to In This Together found upon rereading their pieces that it was like a different person had written them. Sometimes we cringed at the words we used or the things we wrote. I, for one, wish I'd had an Indigenous co-editor. It still feels incredible to me that these contributors, both settler and Indigenous, trusted me with their stories. I was a sleep-deprived new mother who had never edited a collection before, and somehow I got to work with some of the most amazing people on these pieces. It's hard to be so vulnerable on the page or out in the world, and I applaud them for sharing these tough experiences and huge ahas. There's something about memoir, essays, and personal stories that connect us. The small moments lead to huge revelations. The individual life lived shows us so much about ourselves as a society. While not all the contributors from the anthology were available for this anniversary video project, we all continue to work on our individual and community healing and understanding. We just had our first Truth and Reconciliation Day on September 30th here in Canada, after years of seeing Orange Shirt Day gain momentum. This past summer, of course, propelled the abuses and deaths of Indigenous children at Indian residential schools front and center, as remains were uncovered and rediscovered exactly where survivors had always said they would be found. I hope the COVID pandemic is shining even more of a spotlight on inequities, and somehow it is creating cracks for more learning, understanding, and empathy. I'm seeing an amazing number of books, podcasts, and shows by Indigenous creators, and more resources than ever before on how to dismantle oppression and how to stand in solidarity with others fighting for their dignity and rights. As Kamala says in the excerpt from her piece, we're still all working on listening well and finding our place on Turtle Island in what we now call Canada. And as we all say, we're in this together. Please note, some of the excerpts contain adult language, but they all contain beautiful and important truths.
Danse. My name is Kamala Todd, and I'll be reading from my piece called This Many-Storied Land. I'm a Métis Cree transplant in Coast Salish territories, what is now called Metro Vancouver. I have a very strong relationship with this land. My cells have been nurtured by sea, moss, cedar breath, salmonberry. This is the only land I truly know. My mother arrived here from the prairies as a young teenager and had me soon after. My own children were born here and are growing up in this beautiful rainforested place. My father, a child of German immigrants, was also born here. This is my home, but I have no illusions about being from here. This is not my land. My ancestors come from Cree grasslands, Ireland, and Germany. To live in someone else's traditional territory is to build new roots and homes, but not necessarily understanding. People who are not Indigenous to a place may be oblivious to just how deep the roots go and how destructive colonization and city building have been to the land and to the people who have always lived there. While every North American city is what I call an indigenous city, most of these cities conceal their indigenous roots. How did it come to be that thousands of years of indigenous presence are ignored? And what are the consequences of this erasure? And next, I will read a little section describing a plaque that I came across in Vancouver one day. There, in cast bronze relief, was Vancouver's archetypal origin story, commemorating the location where its first land commissioner stood in the silent solitude of the primeval forest and drove a wooden stake in the earth and commenced to measure an empty land into the streets of Vancouver. I shook my head. How can people erase entire societies, the very societies that shared this land and its abundant wealth? There was the evidence writ large of how Indigenous people have been written out of the story and how the myth of terra nullius has been deeply embedded. In overwriting the stories of the local Indigenous people, in depopulating the land and claiming it as free for the taking, these typical first spike narratives present the city as a place made and founded by the dominant Anglo culture, the Great White Fathers. There is no space for Indigenous people in this story or in the remade place. Such normalized histories reinforce the segregation and dismissal of Indigenous people on their own lands. There is little or no sense of accountability to any laws, protocols, Indigenous rights and title, because after all, there was no one here. Seeing this upsetting colonial fiction inscribed on the landscape, I was more determined than ever to challenge this harmful narrative of erasure. And I realized that the best way for me to do this was through story, using the tools that I have as a filmmaker and the access to municipal decision-making that I have as a community planner. My mother, as a formally trained and gifted filmmaker, has taken on the Hollywood thing, and I, an urban geographer, would take on the myths and stories of my city. I firmly believe the more people listen to the stories of this land, the more people learn how Vancouver was truly made, the more understanding and inclusion we can achieve. The wider community needs to do the work, to listen and to learn. I hope all of us whose ancestors are elsewhere will learn the language of the land and connect to our new homes with a better understanding of the deep Indigenous roots everywhere we step. We are fortunate to make these places our home, and we can show our gratitude by always being mindful of the people who have so generously shared their land. We can be protectors ourselves, listening well and respectfully finding our place in the many storied land.
Hi, I'm Joanna Streetley, one of the contributors to In This Together. In my essay, I mention a protest that happened in Tofino, and I'll just read you a little bit about it. On that day in September, what started out as an information protest about the army at Oka and the stoning of Mohawk women and children there erupted into a geyser of aggression. The protest was planned as a peaceful affair, but turned into a volatile mess of beer-drinking hecklers shouting racist epithets and hypercharged people in trucks trying to ram the protesters, about 75% of whom were non-native. 2 children even narrowly escaped being run over. Innocent tourists were threatened. Communication was reduced to, "Fuck you, fucking asshole." Even old Ben, one of my favorite elders, is forever etched in my mind's eye, waving his stick above his head and yelling to the hecklers in his frail voice, "Why didn't you come over here and tell me that?" What shocked me so much was the rapidity with which the situation ignited. My small town had flown from peace to war in 5 minutes. The aggression was supported by a self-righteous anger that had no clear foundation, yet there it was, simmering under the surface in a way I hadn't perceived. I was so new to Canada, and I suddenly saw with terrible clarity what my partner meant when he told of the prejudice he and his family had faced all their lives. and the words of Heshquit chief Simon Lucas, who spoke so beautifully at the end of the protest, echoed through my head. "You only see us with one eye," he said. I think it's time that we all work towards seeing each other with both eyes.
I am going to read an excerpt here from my essay entitled Echo. And Echo is the name of my childhood friend that I grew up with in Northern Alberta. And Rose is the name of the First Nations woman who approached me to write her story of growing up in a residential school. The day Rose and I had the conversation that put the chill on our relationship, we'd been collaborating for more than 6 months. Her request that I cancel the article just as I was sprinting to finish the draft seemed to come out of nowhere. Looking back, if I'd been more sensitive, more attuned, I would have seen it approaching as clearly as a thunderstorm across parched prairie. At the time, however, her concerns made no sense. That the article had too much detail, that it would undermine publishing opportunities for a book in the same way that an overly inclusive movie trailer sapped audience interest in the movie, and that she didn't want to shame the people who had abused her or to hurt their children. I tried desperately to dissuade her, to reason my way back from the firm footing I'd once held. The harder I tried, the more I found the ground beneath me dropping away like dry earth from a cliff's edge. Give her time, my agent advised me. So I did. I sent Rose an email saying the decision was hers to make and that I would respect it, but not before laying out the evidence that well-written articles do lead to book publishing deals and offering to change people's names to protect their identities. I promised to follow up with her on a specific date, and in what I considered an act of magnanimity, I attached a copy of my draft article, hoping that in reading the words I'd written, she would find her answer. I was right. Rose contacted me first, but not with the response I'd wanted. After some thought, she explained in an email, she didn't think we'd be good collaborators. Our ideas are different, she wrote. This was your book, written in your voice. Her words now seem to me to embody the essence of our country's long and unequal relationship with the First Nations. Like the home of a childhood friend I'd never stepped foot in, there was something in Rose's and my connection that eluded me. It took weeks, however, for me to realize this, and longer before I began to understand that just because my skin was a darker shade and I'd grown up with a First Nations friend named Echo, I did not have an insider's discernment. As I thought about my long-held paradigm, its fabric became gossamer thin. I'd left my hometown more than 30 years earlier, and in that time had no significant friendships with First Nations. And what of Echo, the young woman on whose shoulders I'd long stood to claim my vaulted perspective? I'd seen her just once since high school, and it was only by chance. We ran into each other on the University of Alberta campus, and though overcome with fond remembrance, we had only the briefest of conversations. I can't recall what we talked about, only that I'd been surprised to see the glittering row of piercings that lined her ears, from the tips of their lobes to the curls at her hairline. My lasting impression of that passing encounter was that each puncture marked an experience I had not endured and could never fathom. I lost track of Echo after that, finding her again 7 years ago through social media. I gave her a brief synopsis of my rather mainstream life, married, one child and career, and asked for her news. It was a few years, perhaps longer, before she wrote back. She apologized for the delay, saying she had her crazy reasons and that she'd been on a bit of a roller coaster in this life. I wanted to ask Echo what she meant, but I never found the courage. Our correspondence remained light and sporadic, and I recently discovered that she'd started her own business working with dogs. I couldn't help but wonder if her choice was because dogs were more loyal and constant than people in whom she had placed her trust. Early in my relationship with Rose, before I destroyed the trust she placed in me, I asked why her mother had allowed a complete stranger from the government to walk into her wilderness home and take her baby away. Native people, we acquiesce, Rose said. On that score, however, I like to think she was wrong. Rose did not simply hand over her remarkable story to someone she thought was going to appropriate it. And though I will not be the person to write it, I'm grateful to her for forcing me to examine my long-held biases and beliefs. I'm also humbled by Rose's capacity, in spite of all she has suffered, to see the good in encounters with others and never close the door. In the final line of her email, she told me to take good care of myself, that if I wanted to meet for an occasional cup of coffee, she would welcome it. I'm not sure if I'll take Rose up on her offer, but a few days ago I exchanged telephone numbers with Echo. And when we talk, I plan on asking a lot of questions I should have taken the time to ask a long time ago, including where she grew up.
My chapter in the book In This Together is called To Kill an Indian. My dad took a lot of pictures when we lived in Coral Harbour, Nunavut in the 1970s. One of the central figures in our lives at that time there on Southampton Island was the Catholic priest. We were Jews in a half-Catholic, half-Protestant traditional Inuit community with a population of about 350 residents. Inuit dominated then as they do now, with a total number of Chabunak, non-Inuit, numbering about 20. We in particular stood out and seemed to attract a lot of interest from the local priest. I think he thought our redemption a personal challenge, one that he was bound to fail, but he didn't know that. He cut a deal with us. My father would attend Catholic Mass at Easter and Christmas, and the priest would attend our home for Passover and Hanukkah. One of the pictures in our extensive collection is of my then 4-year-old sister sitting on the post office counter, dressed in a bright red parka with fur-lined hood. The priest's arm was circled around her small body. I always thought it was a simple yet beautiful picture. It always made me smile. We loved our time in Coral Harbour, or at least the other 4 members of the family did. That sister was too young to have any memories of place or time. Knowing what I know now about the residential school system and the propensity for priests and lay people to be perpetrators of so much sexual abuse, I now view that picture with some suspicion and discomfort. It didn't help that one of my clients, in his narrative on sexual abuse in the residential school system, made a passing reference to this particular priest. There was no residential school in Coral Harbour, so whatever abuse occurred at the hands of this particular priest, if any, would not have occurred within the context of this client's testimony. I didn't pursue this revelation because it had nothing to do with the client's claim, but I couldn't help but wonder what was going on in that priest's mind when that picture was taken. Did he touch my sister? I'll never know. Nor will she, because frankly she was too young to have any active memory of that time.
My name is Erica Lukert, and this is an excerpt from my essay, Drawing Lines. Treaty 6 covers more than 190,000 square kilometers in the midsection of what are now Alberta and Saskatchewan, including the cities of Edmonton, Lloydminster, Saskatoon, and Prince Albert. And all it took in 1876 to write that land away was a single paragraph. The treaty describes the boundary in terms of the land's natural features, taking rivers and mountain ranges as its markers to draw a line from Cumberland Lake in Saskatchewan through Alberta to the Rocky Mountains and back through the southern part of the 2 provinces. Thence westerly up the said river to its source, thence on a straight line in a westerly direction. The dated phrases sounded almost poetic to my modern ear. To the junction therewith of the outlet of said river. I had to force myself to read past the elegant prose to its effect. traditional lands stripped away with a few sentences. All of the people who lived on those lands with this treaty would cede, release, surrender, and yield up that home forever. Yes, those are the words they used. And there wasn't even a map, nothing to show how large this land really was, how important. Nothing to hint at the magnitude of what was being surrendered that summer of 1876. Well over 100 years later, reading this treaty, I wanted to understand those. I wanted to understand just how these words defined the land, to understand this treaty the only way that I, as a writer, knew how. I wanted to follow its words. So I set out mapping them. I took the text from the treaty and I found a map of the treaty boundary. I began with the first words of that colonizing paragraph, commencing at the mouth of the river, and I wrote those words in their place on the map.
Hello, my name is Catherine Palmer-Gordon, and this is an excerpt from my essay, Mother Tongues. Let's say your first language is English. Could be French if you prefer. This is Canada after all. Either way, English or French, it's your first language and part of who you are. You learned it as an infant. It's the fundamental way you express yourself as an adult. You understand every nuance of meaning in each word and phrase, everything written between the lines. When you hear it and speak it, something you get to do every day in this officially bilingual country of ours, your connection to your nationhood and culture is nourished and thrives. It's easy to take for granted. Press 1 for English, tapez 2 pour le français. We all know what that means. It's part of our national identity, about as Canadian as it gets. That's what language does for us. It identifies us, anchors us to place and heritage and culture, and allows us to communicate effortlessly with our fellow speakers, so they understand us with no need to divine further meaning or intent. For the 1.5 million Canadian Indigenous people whose mother tongues are not officially recognised in this country, however, whose languages are not taught in schools or celebrated in spelling bees and crossword puzzles and board games and writing contests, or used in hospitals and dental offices and government services, it's a different matter. What number do you press to speak in Ho'oponopono or Cree or Mi'kmaq? The likelihood today of a First Nations person in Canada hearing their language spoken on a daily basis is very small. The 2011 census reported that only 15% of Indigenous people in Canada still regularly use their original languages. In British Columbia, home to more than half the country's original languages, 6 have become permanently silent. The remaining 32, spoken by just 5% of the First Nations population of the province, are at serious risk of joining them. Does that matter in a country where the languages of government, commerce, education, entertainment, and society in general are English and French? Why pay any attention to dialects that are all but forgotten, save by a small fraction of the population? Why on earth should we care? Because it matters, and it matters deeply. We must pay attention, because as a country, we cannot afford to lose any more of this country's original languages. If the peoples of Canada are ever to achieve understanding and reconciliation between each other, no matter which language we speak, then we must care about the full revival of these languages and the right of all First Nations people in the country to learn and speak them fluently. The languages of the Mi'kmaq, the Milicete, the Algonquin, Seneca, Cree, Mohawk, Anishinaabe, Dene, Innu, Ojibwe, Ktunaxa, Haida, and Ho'oponopono nations, and all of the other peoples whose names illuminated the map of Canada long before the country existed, and eons before the English and the French ever came. In the language of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, whose lands I now live on, Haitchka.
I'm Rhonda Cronick, and I wrote the essay, White Aboriginal Woman. When I reread the essay to decide what to read from it, I realized how much I've changed since I wrote it. I've learned so much in the past 5 years, that if I wrote this essay today, it would be very different. But one thing that would change little is my conclusion. I'm reading a couple of paragraphs from that. As I learn more, I get angrier, I get disgusted, and I get discouraged. How can this remarkable country be led by a government that doesn't think the deaths of hundreds of Aboriginal women are worthy of investigation, even when their communities cry out for help? How can my country allow the vast percentage of the homeless to be the people who made it possible for so many of us to make our homes here? How can our prison system be predominantly full of Aboriginal people who make up only a small portion of our population? How can we claim to believe in human rights when we can't even keep our word on treaty rights? And how can we accept a prime minister who stated in a G20 news conference in 2009 that we have no history of colonialism? The same prime minister whose government would not sign the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Colonialism had a profound impact on the Canadian landscape. Many Canadians, including those from the European side of my ancestry, might say it was for the best and that it's time to forget the past and move into the future. But ignoring the past doesn't make it right, nor does it make the past go away. Rather than ignore the past, maybe it's time to acknowledge it and deal with it in a just manner. Once we do that, we can move forward in a new direction that eliminates all remnants of our colonial past. Maybe that's too idealistic. After all, Canada's history is deeply rooted in colonialism. But if Granny can fight for and receive her status, and a white Aboriginal woman from a small town in central BC can begin to understand the roots of some of Canada's current problems, then surely others can too.